Before the lilies faded and the hymns grew quiet, I learned that grief doesn't end with goodbye. It begins with what we never dared to ask. My name is Margaret Hale, and what you're about to hear are the echoes of a life divided between love, loss, and truth. If my story touched you, stay close. Subscribe and walk with me through every chapter. The day of Robert's funeral still lingers like a photograph left too long in the sun. Colors faded, edges curling, but the ache intact. The church smelled of lilies and dust, that strange marriage of life and decay that only sanctuaries can hold. I remember the hush before the hymns began, how the silence itself felt holy and cruel. He came to me then, Reverend Whitmore, his voice soft enough to blend with the organ's hum. He reached for the hymn book resting beside me, his fingers brushing mine as though by accident. "Allow me," he said, opening it to "Abide with me." But the way he held it, close against his chest, as if it belonged to him, stirred something unsettled inside me. At first I thought grief was playing tricks. Grief always rearranges memories, turning ordinary gestures into questions. But when I looked around, I saw a few heads tilt, quiet glances exchanged. It was the way he spoke of Robert during his eulogy. Robert was a man of silent faith. I knew him once in ways few did. The words struck a note too intimate, too rehearsed. I felt a flicker of humiliation, that private kind that burns quietly behind lowered eyes. After the service, the rain began, soft, reluctant. I stood under the church awning, the hymn book still in my hands. The gold lettering on the cover had long faded. The pages smelled faintly of candle smoke and cedar. I traced one corner absent-mindedly until I saw it. A faint scrawl of handwriting along the edge of the first page. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Robert's neat cursive either. It looked old, slanted, and strangely familiar. "Keep this safe," it said, though the ink had bled enough to make the words look like a whisper, half erased by time. That evening, I placed the book on the table beside Robert's photograph. His smile there was the same one he wore the night before he died, tired, kind, but holding something back. I'd grown used to that half-truth in his eyes. It used to comfort me. Now it unsettled me. I tried to pray. The words came out thin, like smoke from a candle that's lost its flame. I asked for peace, but peace wouldn't come. Instead, I kept seeing the Reverend's hands, steady, deliberate, as he turned the pages of that hymn book. The following Sunday, I attended service again. I told myself it was for comfort, but perhaps it was curiosity that led me there. Whitmore spoke of mercy that morning, of the beauty of truth that doesn't destroy but refines. "God's grace," he said, "does not hide the wound, it purifies it." I remember those words because they landed like a challenge. After the sermon, he found me by the doorway. "You're holding up bravely, Mrs. Hale," he said. "Bravery is often quieter than it looks," I replied, my tone softer than my thoughts. He smiled, and for a brief moment, I saw guilt flicker behind his eyes, like a shadow of someone he used to be. That night, unable to sleep, I opened the hymn book again. Between the thin pages, I found more faint markings, tiny crosses beside certain hymns, short notes written in a hurried hand. One of them read, "He forgave me first." The words didn't sound like scripture. They sounded personal. I thought about asking Whitmore directly, but something in me hesitated. The church was his stage, and I had no wish to play the part of accuser. Yet, I couldn't ignore the echo of his voice at the funeral. I knew him once in ways few did. What did he mean by that? There are moments in life when silence feels like loyalty, and others when it feels like cowardice. I wasn't sure yet which one mine was. Later that week, I walked to the church alone. The door was unlocked. It usually was. The air inside carried the faint chill of stone and old wood. I ran my fingers along the pews as I walked toward the altar. The same hymn book lay open there, as if waiting for me. From the corner of my eye, I saw Whitmore step out from the vestry, surprised but composed. "You shouldn't be here after hours," he said gently. "Neither should the truth," I answered, before I could stop myself. He paused, then smiled with the kind of patience that can only come from long practice. "Truth has its time, Mrs. Hale. Sometimes it waits for mercy to arrive first." I held his gaze, and sometimes mercy hides behind it. He said nothing more, but his silence spoke enough. The candlelight behind him trembled, and for a brief instant I imagined another version of him, one less certain, more human, perhaps even afraid. When I left, I took the hymn book with me. Outside, the evening wind carried the faint sound of bells from a neighboring chapel. I pressed the book against my chest, feeling its worn spine like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I didn't know yet why it felt so vital, only that it held something of Robert, something of Whitmore, and something unnamed that tied the two together. Grief has a way of disguising truth as comfort. And sometimes the hands that console us hold more than kindness. They hold secrets too. But I wasn't ready to see that yet. Not fully. That night, before sleep took me, I whispered to the dark, "If truth is what heals, then let it hurt first." And as the house settled into silence, I could almost hear the rustle of turning pages, like the hymn book was answering back. The following morning, the air outside was pale and uncertain, like the world itself had not yet decided whether to mourn or to begin again. I sat by the window, the hymn book resting open on my lap. The inked notes on its margins caught the early light, ghostly reminders that even devotion leaves fingerprints. I hadn't planned on seeing Reverend Whitmore that day, but when I passed the church on my way to the market, I saw him sweeping fallen leaves from the stone steps. His movements were unhurried, the kind of grace that can only come from years of tending both ground and souls. Yet there was a fragility to him that morning, as if the weight of every unspoken truth pressed invisibly against his back. "Good morning, Reverend," I called. He looked up, his smile steady, but his eyes, the eyes never lie, carried that same shadow I'd noticed at the funeral. "Mrs. Hale," he said warmly, "you look well today." "Appearances can be kind," I replied. He chuckled softly. "They can also be deceitful." I don't know if he realized how those words landed. Perhaps he did. He invited me inside for tea. The church kitchen smelled faintly of old wood and lemon oil. The kettle hissed like a reluctant confidant. On the table beside us lay a small book of parables, its cover cracked, its pages marked with faded ribbons. He opened it absent-mindedly and began to read aloud, his voice steady and low. "A man once built a house on sand, knowing the storm would come. He told himself that faith would keep the walls standing. But when the flood arrived, it wasn't the storm that ruined him. It was his unwillingness to see the cracks before it was too late." He closed the book. "We mistake silence for strength, Mrs. Hale," he said, staring into the rising steam. "Sometimes confession is the only kind of courage heaven recognizes." For a moment, I felt a tremor of compassion for him. His words held the tone of someone speaking to himself as much as to me. I set my cup down carefully. "Then why is it," I asked, "that those who guide others often hide the most?" He met my gaze, calm but unreadable. Because guidance is easier when one's own sins are buried. People listen more readily to the man who appears whole. "Appearances again," I said. "You spoke of them once before." He smiled faintly. "I did, and I suspect you've been thinking about it ever since." I hesitated. There was no point pretending otherwise. At the funeral, when you mentioned knowing Robert in ways few did, what did you mean by that? He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow sip of tea, buying himself the kind of silence that stretches like wire. "Your husband was a man of faith," he said finally, "but also a man who wrestled with it. Didn't we all?" He nodded. "Yes, some more visibly than others." It wasn't an answer, but it was something. Later that afternoon, I lingered in the pews long after the others had gone. The church was empty, except for the sound of distant birds and the faint creak of old wood. The light through the stained glass painted the air in fragments, blue, red, gold. It felt like standing inside a broken promise that was still trying to be beautiful. I opened the hymn book again. The same page he'd turned to at the funeral was now folded at the corner, as if marked intentionally. The hymn read, "Lead Kindly Light." In the margin, written in that same faded hand, were 4 words, "The light knows everything." I felt a chill run through me, though the sun still touched my shoulders. That night, I couldn't shake his parable from my mind. The man who built on sand, not because he didn't believe, but because he refused to look at his own cracks. It echoed too closely to what I suspected about Whitmore. And perhaps, if I were honest, about myself. Faith, I realized, isn't always a fortress. Sometimes it's a mirror, and I wasn't sure I liked what I saw in mine. A few days later, I asked to meet with him again. We sat in the sanctuary this time, the afternoon light pouring in like soft gold through the high windows. I told him that his story had stayed with me. He smiled, faintly amused. "It has a way of doing that." "I thought about the man in the story," I said. "He built on sand because he wanted faith to do the work truth was meant to do. I've done that too. I think Robert did as well." He looked at me then, truly looked, as if he saw both confession and accusation in the same breath. "You're not alone in that, Mrs. Hale." "No," I replied, "but I wonder if you are." The silence that followed was almost tender. It wasn't the silence of denial. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous, deciding whether to step forward. He exhaled slowly. "If faith is a mirror," he said, "then truth is the light that shows the cracks. We all prefer dim rooms." I closed the hymn book in my lap. Between the comfort that soothes and the truth that hurts, I think I'd rather hurt. He nodded, and for the first time, I saw his composure falter. "Then you already understand more than most," he whispered. A breeze moved through the open doorway, carrying the faint scent of rain. It lifted the edge of the hymn book's pages like invisible fingers turning them. Somewhere within those thin sheets lay the story neither of us yet dared to tell. As I left the church, I looked back at him. He stood by the altar, framed by stained glass light, a man painted in borrowed colors. There was dignity in him still, but also a tremor I couldn't unsee. And in that tremor, I recognized the beginning of truth. The first cool breath of autumn moved through the house the way old memories do. Soft, uninvited, opening doors I thought were shut. I lit a small lamp on Robert's desk and set the hymn book beneath it. The shade cast a warm circle over the worn leather, the way a mother might cup her hands around a child's face to make sure it's really there. Outside, a branch tapped the window with patient insistence. Inside, my own heart matched its rhythm. I ran my fingers along the edges again, this time slower. The paper felt thin but stubborn, the kind that refuses to tear easily. Several pages in, between "Nearer, my God, to Thee" and "Rock of Ages," I found a strip of ribbon barely holding on. Under it, the ink I'd seen before grew darker, as if the words had been waiting for more light. It was a dedication, small, deliberate letters leaning forward like a man who's made up his mind. For Samuel, the light you lent me saved my soul. R. I traced the S first, not a flourish, not a preacher's S, a practical S, quick and certain. The line after R was unmistakable. It was Robert's way of signing when he felt something too deeply to write it all out, just an initial, as if more would diminish the truth. Samuel. I said the name aloud. It wasn't a word from our home. It wasn't a friend I remembered from his younger days. The sound of it in my mouth felt like a key that didn't yet match any lock in the house. The lamp hummed softly, and my eye caught a tiny note printed in the corner of the page, almost invisible in the crease. Ezekiel 34:12. I had to breathe slowly to steady my hands. I went to the family Bible, the one with pressed flowers and fingerprints from years of Sunday mornings, and turned to the verse, "I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness." It read like someone had underlined my life. I closed the Bible, returned to the hymn book, and felt the pulse of humiliation again, the memory of Whitmore's voice at the funeral, confident, intimate. If he were merely a pastor doing his duty, why did the dedication in my home speak to a Samuel who had lent Robert light? Why was the book in his hands as though it belonged to him? The floorboards creaked. The house has learned to speak in small syllables since Robert left. I sat down and listened to the quiet. Grief makes you believe nothing is moving, and yet everything inside is rearranging itself. When the rearrangement hurts enough, you either turn away or you turn toward it. I realized in that moment I had been standing at the doorway of truth for weeks, pretending I didn't see the handle. I took out a sheet of stationery from the drawer. Cream, with a faint border Robert always said looked too dignified for ordinary life. I wrote slowly, "Reverend Whitmore, I found something that belongs to you, or perhaps to the man you were before you were a reverend. I don't wish to embarrass you or Robert. I only wish to understand. Will you meet me in the sanctuary tomorrow evening, after the choir leaves?" I signed my name fully, as if I were stepping over a line I'd drawn myself. The sound of my pen scratching felt louder than it should. I sealed the note with the smallest amount of gum and pressed it shut, the way one closes a wound and prays the scar will keep its shape. On my way to the church, the late afternoon light slanted across the sidewalk like folded linen. Children laughed somewhere down the street. It seemed indecent that such ordinary joy could exist in the same world as my question. When I reached the steps, I paused. This was not a widow's errand, I told myself. This was a woman's. I slid the envelope under the office door and stood there longer than necessary, listening for footsteps. None came, only the soft echo of the building holding its breath. That night sleep refused me. The house grew large and too full of past tense. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of water and the hymn book open to the dedication. Words do this strange thing. They occupy space. That single line, for Samuel, "The light you lent me," seemed to widen the room until even the clock across from me ticked in a kind of reverence. I pictured Robert, younger, perhaps ashamed or stubborn or beautifully lost, sitting with someone who called himself Samuel. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel betrayed. Instead, I felt something like recognition. We are all rescued in rooms no one else visits. Near dawn, I took the hymn book to the porch. Mist lay over the lawn like a quiet mercy. I closed my eyes and listened to a train far off, a low, faithful sound. When I opened them, I knew what I needed to do. The letter wasn't enough. Not anymore. I would not let the man who comforted me also be the man who kept me from the truth. At mid-morning, I returned to the church. The doors were open. The choir rehearsed gently, voices climbing the rafters like stepped prayers. I waited in the last pew until the final note faded. When Reverend Whitmore stepped into the aisle, he looked older than the last time I'd seen him, as if the night had followed him into mourning. "Mrs. Hale," he said, surprised but careful. "I received your note." I rose, hymn book in hand. "Then you know why I came." He looked at the book. His eyes paused on the fraying ribbon, then on the place where my thumb marked the dedication. A shadow crossed his face and left as quickly as it came. We stood close enough to smell old polish and candle wax and the faint trace of wind that visits old churches through keyholes. I opened to the page and turned the book so he could read. His breath caught. "Samuel," I said softly. "Who is he?" He didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he gestured toward the front pew. We sat, side by side, not quite touching, like two confessions determined to keep their distance. I kept my voice low. "There are things I can tolerate not knowing, but not this. Not anymore." He cleared his throat. "Why now?" Because grief asks fewer questions than truth, I said, and I am done grieving. He stared ahead at the altar cloth fluttering slightly in the draught. His hands were folded in his lap, fingers threaded together as if to keep from unraveling. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I was Samuel," he said, "before I was the man you see." My throat tightened, not in shock exactly, but in the relief that comes only when a suspicion leaves the shadows. The name fell into place. The dedication made sense. The funeral words, too intimate to be pastoral, took on a different shape. And yet, 1,000 other shapes still waited behind it. "You knew Robert," I said. He nodded once. "I knew him when I was failing at being a decent man. He gave me a light I didn't deserve." "For Samuel, the light you lent me," I repeated. "He wrote that for you." "Yes." "And why was this book in your hands when he died?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. He swallowed. "Because I gave it back to him years ago and asked him to keep it until I could admit out loud what he did for me." "Then why didn't you say it?" My words were quiet, but they felt heavy enough to leave dents. "Why did you speak as if you were his shepherd and not his debtor?" He closed his eyes. "Because debt sounds like weakness, and shepherds are not supposed to owe sheep." The choir director rustled papers somewhere behind us. The sound broke and fell like dry leaves. I turned a little toward him, not enough to threaten, just enough to refuse retreat. "You said in your sermon that grace doesn't hide the wound," I whispered. "Start there." His mouth opened. Whatever answer he had, it stopped short of air. The organist tried a few searching chords. The church seemed to wait with me. I stood, the book still open between my hands. "Tomorrow evening, after the choir, we'll talk and I will listen. Not as a widow who needs comfort, as a woman who deserves truth." He looked up, a surprised tenderness in his eyes, as if my insistence had lifted something heavy from his chest and set it gently on the floor where he could study it. "I'll be here," he said. "Good," I replied, "because I've decided to be too." I started down the aisle, the hymn book pressed lightly to my side. When I reached the door, I paused and looked back. He hadn't moved. He sat there with the sun through stained glass, turning his shoulders a patchwork of borrowed colors, and for the first time since Robert's funeral, I didn't feel smaller under them. Outside, the afternoon had ripened into that late golden hour when shadows grow long, honest things. I walked home and set the book on the kitchen table, open to the dedication. I knew what the next step was. I had already taken it. The rest would follow. Still, when evening came, the house shifted again. The branch tapped the window. The clock listened. And somewhere near the border of sleep, a thought rose up with a steadiness that frightened me. If he tells me everything tomorrow, what will I do with what I learn? The lamp flickered once, as if in answer. And somewhere inside me, a door clicked, not closed, but not fully open either. The next evening arrived heavy with rain, the kind that begins without warning and insists on its own rhythm. It wasn't a storm, not yet, just a constant whisper from the heavens, steady and insistent, like a reminder that some truths are meant to be washed clean before they're spoken. I walked to the church without an umbrella. The streets glistened, reflecting lamplight and memory in equal measure. My shoes gathered the scent of wet earth, and my hands trembled only once, when I touched the brass handle of the door. Inside, the sanctuary waited in its own hush, shadows alive with the flicker of candles left from morning prayers. Reverend Whitmore was already there, sitting in the first pew with his head bowed. The hymn book rested beside him, closed, but not forgotten. When he heard my steps, he didn't look up right away. He finished what sounded like a prayer, one that ended not with amen, but with a sigh that belonged more to a man than to a minister. "You came," he said, finally turning. "I said I would." He nodded. "Then let's not waste the mercy of this hour." The sanctuary seemed to shrink as I approached, as though every pew and every beam leaned closer to listen. He motioned for me to sit beside him, The air carried the faint perfume of candle wax and rain-soaked wool. For a moment, I wanted to believe we were only two weary souls waiting for the storm to pass. But storms of the soul don't pass. They confess themselves. I read the dedication again, I said quietly. It doesn't sound like a man thanking a pastor. It sounds like a man forgiving one. He pressed his lips together, his jaw tightening in that small human way of someone resisting tears. You're right. It was forgiveness. Robert offered it when I didn't have the courage to ask. The rain grew louder outside, each drop like a bead on a rosary counting sins one by one. Tell me, I said. Tell me who you were before this robe. He inhaled deeply, as if drawing in years. Before the collar, I was Samuel Whitmore. I worked in trade, money, influence, those glittering things that make men forget their own names. I met Robert during one of those years when everything I touched turned false. He was working for a local charity then, quiet, but relentless. I mocked him for it. I thought faith was just another kind of theater. But I was wrong. He stopped, his hands tightening over his knees. There was an accounting scandal. I lied to protect myself. I falsified signatures. Robert found out. He didn't expose me. He confronted me privately. I expected judgment. Instead, he lent me his silence and his trust. He said, "When you find your truth again, return this hymn book." It was his way of saying, "Start over, Samuel." I turned my gaze toward the altar. The candles wavered, throwing uncertain light across the polished wood. "And you did start over." I tried. I left the business. I entered seminary under my middle name. I thought I'd buried Samuel for good. His voice cracked then, small and raw. But when I saw your husband's name on the parish records years later, I knew I'd never truly buried him. I thought I could make peace by being his shepherd. Instead, I stood at his grave and spoke as if I had no debt to him. That is my deception. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence like grace filling an empty vessel. I could feel the ache of his confession, not as a wound inflicted, but as one shared. "I wish you'd told me sooner," I said softly. "I wish I'd told myself," he whispered. "But I feared that truth would undo everything the church believed of me. My faith was still built on sand, even here." I opened the hymn book and turned it toward him. The dedication gleamed faintly in the candlelight. "He lent you light. It's time you gave it back properly." He looked at me, really looked, and I saw something break open behind his eyes. Not despair, not guilt, recognition. The kind that feels like kneeling after years of standing proud. "I don't know how," he said. "Begin with the truth. The rest will follow." He smiled weakly. "You sound more like the preacher tonight." "Then consider it borrowed grace," I said. He laughed once, softly, like a man learning how to breathe again. Then he reached for the hymn book. His hand shook as it brushed mine. "This belongs to both of us now," he said. "The forgiven and the forgiving." Outside, thunder murmured in the distance, low, steady, not yet threatening. He stood, walking toward the altar, the hymn book clutched close to his chest. The movement was slow but resolute, like someone returning something sacred he had kept too long. From the doorway, I watched as he placed the book beneath the cross, then rested his hand over it. His lips moved soundlessly. It wasn't prayer. It was promise. When he turned back to me, I saw peace trying to find its way into the lines of his face. "There's more you should know," he said. "About what your husband did for me. About the letters." "Letters?" I asked, though my pulse already knew the answer. "Yes," he said, "the ones he wrote when I left town. I kept them. Every one." The candles flickered as if something unseen had entered the room. He hesitated before speaking again. "Would you come tomorrow? I'll show you." I nodded. "I will." He gave a slow, grateful smile, the kind that doesn't reach the lips so much as the soul. "Then tomorrow," he said. I stepped out into the rain, letting it soak my coat, my hair, the doubts that clung to me. The air smelled of wet stone and absolution. I walked home without hurrying, feeling the hymn book's absence like a missing heartbeat, and yet, for the first time, that absence didn't ache. The streetlights flickered, and somewhere far off, a bell tolled the late hour. I knew tomorrow would bring something larger than confession, something closer to revelation. But for that night, the rain was enough. It was truth in motion, and I let it wash me clean. The rain ended sometime before dawn, leaving behind the kind of stillness that feels borrowed, too fragile to last. The morning air pressed cool against the windows, and in that pale quiet, I found myself listening for the sound of the church bell. It hadn't rung yet, but I knew it would. It always did before I was ready. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. The hymn book wasn't there. Its absence was a new kind of silence, heavier than grief, lighter than guilt. Between its missing pages lay something unspoken between two men, one buried, one standing in borrowed righteousness, and now between them, me. Whitmore's words from the night before still pulsed through my thoughts. There's more you should know. I didn't know whether to dread or crave that knowledge. Truth, once invited, never leaves quietly. By noon, I found myself back at the church. The front doors were open, and sunlight spilled across the marble floor like a promise that hadn't yet decided whether to be kept. The sanctuary was empty, except for the faint rustle of paper near the altar. Whitmore was there, sitting beneath the tall cross, his hands resting on a stack of envelopes. When he saw me, he smiled faintly. "I didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did I." He gestured toward the pew beside him. "Then perhaps this sleeplessness is our penance." I sat, close enough to see the tremor in his fingers. The envelopes were old, yellowed, bound by a frayed ribbon. He untied them slowly, as though he feared the paper might remember too much. "These," he said, "are Robert's letters. He sent them after I disappeared to the seminary, each one a sermon he never preached." He handed me the top letter. The ink had faded to the color of dried leaves. I unfolded it gently. "Samuel, the hardest truth is not the one that breaks your life. It's the one that rebuilds it in a shape you no longer recognize. Forgiveness is not release, it's responsibility. If one day you ever stand before others wearing the cloth, remember that truth is a kind of prayer. Speak it, even if your voice shakes." I read it twice, then looked up. "He knew you'd become a pastor." Whitmore nodded. "He hoped I would. He said redemption isn't a reward, it's a discipline." The words hung between us, heavy and tender all at once. "Tomorrow," he continued, "I am meant to deliver the sermon for Founders Sunday. The entire parish will be here. If I tell them who I was, what I did, it will destroy the trust they've built around me. But if I stay silent, the truth dies in the same breath that built this altar." He leaned back, eyes fixed on the crucifix above. "I've preached forgiveness for 20 years, Margaret. How do I ask for it now without sounding like a thief reclaiming his own sermon?" I wanted to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come. Something inside me understood too deeply what he meant. After Robert's death, I too had clung to appearances that passed for faith. I smiled at neighbors, I kept routines, I prayed with measured dignity. But inside, I was hollow with unspoken doubt. Maybe we both had been hiding behind devotion, he behind his robe, I behind my grief. I said finally, "The truth doesn't destroy faith, Reverend. It redeems it. The only faith that dies in the light is the kind that was never alive." He turned to me, studying my face as if searching for the conviction he'd lost in his own. "You speak with his voice," he said softly. "Robert's." "Then perhaps you should listen," I answered. He smiled, weary and sad. "If I do this, if I confess, I could lose everything." "You already lost everything when you buried Samuel," I said. "This would just be the resurrection." The word lingered. Resurrection. He closed his eyes, and I saw the weight of that thought press against him. He whispered, "Would you stand with me if I speak?" I hesitated. "That depends on how you speak. If you confess to free yourself, I cannot stand beside that. But if you confess to honor truth, then you won't stand alone." He nodded, and I knew the choice had already been made in him. The question was only how. That afternoon, I walked home beneath the sound of church bells rehearsing for the coming service. They rang not in celebration but in warning, each note an echo of time running out. At home, I sat by the window, staring at the empty space where the hymn book once lay. I imagined it now resting on the altar, its pages bearing both guilt and grace. I thought of Robert's handwriting, firm, sure, unafraid of revelation, and wondered if he had known it would one day bring us here, two reluctant believers trapped between faith and truth. As dusk fell, I opened my journal and wrote a single line. Truth without love is cruelty. Love without truth is cowardice. I didn't know which sin weighed heavier on the soul, but I suspected Whitmore and I were about to find out. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I heard the distant rumble of thunder again. Not the cleansing kind this time. This one carried tension, like something in the sky refusing to forgive. I closed my eyes and pictured the church filled with faces, waiting for a sermon none of them expected to hear. Tomorrow he would stand before them. Tomorrow he would decide whether faith could survive honesty. And somehow I knew whatever choice he made would not belong to him alone. That night the wind returned, not with rain this time, but with the low sigh of leaves turning over themselves. I didn't light the lamps at once. The house was more honest in half-light, each shadow a confession the sun was too polite to notice. On Robert's old desk lay the first of the letters Whitmore had given me. I hadn't planned to read them all, but grief is curious. It invites you to open what should have stayed sealed. The first page began with the rhythm of a man writing to save himself, deliberate, uneven, painfully human. Samuel, if you ever doubt your calling, remember this. Truth does not humiliate, it restores. The lie always asks for silence. The truth asks for courage. The hymn book I gave you is not forgiveness. It's a map. When you can read it without shame, come home. The ink had bled through the paper as though the words themselves couldn't contain their own weight. I ran my fingers over them and felt the texture of years, the kind of forgiveness that takes root only after being watered by regret. I opened the next letter. The handwriting was slower, more deliberate. You asked once how I still believe after all I've lost. I don't believe because I'm sure, Samuel. I believe because I've run out of reasons not to. Faith isn't a feeling. It's a decision made every morning, like breathing. When you preach, remember that truth is never spoken to protect the preacher. It's spoken to free the listener. By the third letter, I was trembling. These weren't sermons from a man trying to save another. They were lifelines thrown from one sinner to another. Robert had carried a secret weight, not of betrayal, but of mercy unspoken. And Whitmore, Samuel, had carried the opposite, salvation borrowed, unpaid. I read until the oil in the lamp grew thin. When the flame wavered, I noticed something strange. The edge of the hymn book's ribbon, frayed, brown from handling, was pressed between two pages of the third letter. A coincidence, maybe, or perhaps Robert had marked something he wanted found later. In the margin of that letter, written in a hand I didn't recognize, were faint pencil lines. Return the light, even if it burns. I closed the letter carefully. The air in the room felt denser, filled with the echo of the man I had buried and the one who had come to confess. For years, I had thought Robert's faith was quiet because it was content. Now I understood. It was quiet because it was carrying someone else's noise. The next morning, I walked back to the church. The sky was gray, the color of linen steeped in thought. Inside, the candles were unlit, the altar bare. Whitmore stood near the pulpit, a single sheet of paper in his hand. He looked smaller somehow, not weaker, but reduced to truth's proper size. "I didn't expect you this early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. "I read the letters." He smiled faintly. "Then you know everything." "Not everything," I said. "Only enough to see you differently." He nodded. "That may be all truth ever does." We sat in the front pew, the one that creaked when anyone dared lean too far into confession. The silence between us was heavy, but not hostile. "Robert's letters," he said quietly, "were my salvation and my sentence. I wanted to live up to them, but I was afraid they'd undo the man I'd become. I told myself that keeping silent protected his legacy. But I see now. I was protecting mine." I studied the man beside me, his collar slightly loosened, his eyes ringed with the sleeplessness of repentance. "Do you still believe you were called to preach?" He hesitated. "I believe I was called to tell the truth. Preaching was just the disguise I used until I remembered how." I smiled sadly. "Then tomorrow is your chance to remember out loud." He looked toward the pulpit, where a single shaft of light pierced the stained glass, cutting across his hands. "Robert told me once that light doesn't choose what it reveals. It simply shines. I used to envy that purity. Now I dread it." "Then that means you're ready," I said. He turned to me. "And you? What will you do when the truth is spoken? When the congregation looks at you and sees the widow of the man who once saved their pastor?" "I'll stand," I said, "not for you, but for him, and for the version of faith that doesn't flinch." He breathed out, long and unsteady, and, "I feared you'd hate me." "I did," I admitted, "for about an hour. Then I remembered how Robert used to pray for both of us, even before I knew why. I suppose hatred doesn't survive in a heart he's touched." Whitmore laughed softly, almost in disbelief. "He was a better preacher than I'll ever be." "Perhaps. But you're still alive. That counts for something." He looked down at the hymn book resting on the altar. "You know, I never really read the inscription aloud before." "Then read it now," I said. He opened the book, his voice trembling slightly. "For Samuel, the light you lent me saved my soul." He paused. "And now it's time to give it back." For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us trembling like a held breath. Then he handed me the book. "Tomorrow," he said, "you should hold it during the sermon. Let them see where it came from. I will speak the truth, but you will be its witness." The weight of it in my hands felt different this time. Not heavier, but truer. The leather was worn smooth by faith, guilt, forgiveness, all the same touch in different seasons. As I left the church, the sun broke through for the first time in days. Its light spilled through the stained glass, turning the floor into a mosaic of forgiveness, imperfect but whole. Outside, children ran through puddles, laughing, unafraid of getting dirty. I envied their freedom, but only for a moment. There was a kind of holiness in their mess. That night, I placed the hymn book on the dresser beside Robert's photograph. The same smile, the same mystery. I traced the edge of the book, whispering words I hadn't dared say aloud before. "You lent him light," I said to the photo. "Now it's coming home." And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift. Not grief, not even peace, but a gentle readiness, the kind that comes when a wound begins to breathe again. Tomorrow would be Sunday. Tomorrow the truth would have a voice. Sunday morning rose the color of old linen, a soft gray that made even the birds sound reverent. I woke before the bell, before the neighborhood remembered how to move, and I stood in the doorway of the room where Robert's photograph keeps its quiet watch. The hymn book rested beside him, the ribbon like a vein of sepia running through a body of leather and prayer. I lifted it and felt its familiar weight settle into my palms. Not a burden, a vow. I brewed tea and let it go cold. I tried to eat and could not. There are days when the body holds its breath on behalf of the soul, and this was one. I paced a little, then stopped myself. Pacing makes time louder. I needed time to be still, still enough that I could hear what remained of faith in me, the part that doesn't perform, the part that simply refuses to lie. When the bell finally sounded, a single note against the morning, I wrapped the book in Robert's old handkerchief and walked to the church. People had begun to gather at the steps, their Sunday best carrying the scent of starch and expectation. I nodded to neighbors who have learned to speak to me softly. Some placed hands on my arm, in that way people do when they mean well but don't know what to say. I smiled for them, because kindness deserves answering, even when your mouth is borrowed for the task. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with that honeyed light that finds wood beautiful just for being old. The banner for Founders Sunday hung from the balcony, its fabric heavy with names and years. A child near the front kicked his heels against the pew, each soft thud like a small drum, reminding the room that life does not pause for our courage to catch up. Reverend Whitmore stood near the pulpit, speaking with the choir director. When he saw me, he excused himself and crossed the aisle. Up close, he carried a strange peace, the kind that follows a decision made not with confidence, but with obedience. "You came," he said, voice steadier than his hands. "I told you I would," I answered. I held up the handkerchief. "And I brought what you asked." He swallowed. "Thank you." We found the small side room where the acolytes keep their robes. The door clicked softly behind us. He leaned a shoulder against the wall, as if the plaster could absorb some part of what he was about to do. "I wrote a few notes," he said, patting the folded paper in his pocket. "But I think I'll have to speak more plainly than ink allows." "Plainly is best," I said. "Plainly is the only way that doesn't bruise." He nodded. "Will you stand near the front? Not with me, just present." "I'll be there," I said. "But there's something else." He waited. I unwrapped the hymn book and set it on the small wooden table meant for candles. The leather looked almost black in that dim room. The embossing long ago surrendered to touch and time. I opened to the dedication and read it again, not because I had forgotten the words, but because the words had not yet finished their work in me. "For Samuel," I whispered, "the light you lent me saved my soul." He closed his eyes. "I cannot keep this," I said. "Not anymore. If I keep it, it remains a souvenir. If you take it, it becomes testimony." He opened his eyes and searched my face for permission he didn't know how to ask. I slid the book toward him. "Take it," I said, "and don't hide it in your study. Carry it where everyone can see. Let the pages be what they were meant to be, a map you walk with, not a secret you curate." His fingers hovered, then settled on the cover. "You're certain?" "No," I said, "but I am faithful. Sometimes that's all we get." He gave a small, broken laugh, the kind that comes from a sore place finally learning to stretch. "You sound like the letters." "Then at least one of us is consistent." We returned to the sanctuary before the procession. The organist tested a phrase, a few careful steps toward a melody that would soon fill every rafter. I moved to the second pew. He climbed the small set of stairs and stood at the pulpit, shoulders squared but not proud. He placed the hymn book on top of his notes and rested his hand on it, the way a man swears an oath without saying so. The choir began. Voices rose, clear and ordinary and holy, as they always are when human breath is brave enough to form praise. I watched the congregation, faces I know by their stories more than their names, settle into the music with that relief people feel when they are given permission to stop pretending for a little while. Between hymns, he stepped forward. The room rearranged itself around him. He didn't open with a verse. He didn't open with a joke. He opened with silence, and the silence did the work of 1,000 arguments. "I owe you something," he said finally. The sound of his voice carried without effort. Not an explanation, not a defense, a truth. The word truth made something in my chest lift and stiffen at once. He looked out over the pews, not searching for allies, simply counting souls as one counts blessings and debts. His hand remained on the book. "I once had another name," he said, "and a life that did not deserve your trust." He paused, then added, "A man saved me, not by hiding what I was, but by seeing me and refusing to leave me there." I felt the pew breathe. People shifted, not forward, not away, just deeper. "I have stood in this place for years," he continued, "thinking I could preach well enough to repay a mercy I never acknowledged in public. I was wrong. Mercy is not repaid. It is returned." He lifted the hymn book then, just a little, so those closest could see. The ribbon trembled like a thin flame. "This was given to me by the man who lent me light," he said. "His name is Robert Hale." A sound moved through the room, not shock exactly, more like a collective intake of breath before diving into cold water. A few heads turned toward me, not accusing, not pitying, simply placing me in the geometry of what was being drawn. He let the sound pass. "I have done my parish a different kind of harm than the scandals you read about. I have harmed you by letting a symbol speak louder than the confession it was meant to carry. Today, I am returning what I owe." He looked down at the book, then back up. "If I have been a shepherd, it is only because I was first a lost man who was found." A child coughed. Someone whispered a name. A hymn page crackled as a nervous hand refolded it. The organist kept his hands folded in his lap, as if even music knew it should wait its turn. I thought of Robert's letters, of the way his words always refused to make themselves the hero. I thought of the night he died, the way I held his hand and did not know I was holding the rope that had once pulled someone else from deep water. A heat rose in me that was not anger and not pride, something quieter and heavier. Gratitude, perhaps, with bones. He continued, "There are details I will not share because they are not mine to spend. But there is one thing I must say plainly. Whatever good has come through me began with a debt, and whatever good comes after this will begin with this confession." He closed his eyes for a breath, then opened them. "If you need to leave, I will understand. If you need to question me, I will answer. If you need to forgive me, do not rush. Forgiveness is not the speed of the forgiver. It is the pace of the wound." The room held him. It did not applaud. It did not break. It simply held. He looked down, and I watched the smallest tremor move through his hand. He pressed the hymn book to his chest, not the way he had at the funeral, as if staking a claim, but as a man embraces a promise he finally intends to keep. "Before I say anything more," he said, voice lower now, "I want to read a line written inside this book." He opened to the first page, and the paper made that sound of thin things being brave. "For Samuel, the light you lent me saved my soul." He let the sentence stand alone. He didn't interpret it. He didn't borrow its dignity for his own. He simply gave the words the silence they deserved, and in that silence I felt something release. A small knot I'd carried under my ribs since the day I wore black and pretended black knew what to do with grief. He closed the book and set it carefully on the pulpit. "I will not ask you to trust me today," he said. "I will ask you to trust the truth, and I will stand under whatever that trust demands." He took a breath, then another, and for a heartbeat I thought he might falter. He didn't. He turned a page of his notes, found a verse, and read it like a man who had finally stopped negotiating with himself. In the second pew, my hands lay open in my lap. I did not pray. I listened. It felt holier. When the closing hymn began, the congregation rose slowly, as if each body needed permission from each soul. We sang words we all knew, and yet they sounded different, like a language rediscovered. As the last chord faded, he did not dismiss us with a benediction. He dismissed us with an invitation. "If you wish to speak," he said, "I will be here. If you wish to leave, go in peace. If you wish to stay and sit in the silence, there is room for that too. People moved in the polite confusion that follows a new way of doing an old thing. Some approached him, some slipped out, some sat. I remained where I was until the aisle had emptied into a hush. He met me at the end of the pew, eyes bright and undone. "You did it," I said. "No," he answered. "Truth did. I merely stopped resisting it." I nodded and reached for the hymn book resting on the pulpit. I held it for a breath, then placed it back in his hands. "Keep it," I said, "not as a trophy, as a reminder of who holds whom." He understood. He didn't thank me. He only bowed his head the smallest fraction, the way a man bows to a gravestone when the conversation is not over. I turned to go, but a thought found me at the threshold and would not let me pass. Words spoken in a room are one thing, the life that follows them is another. Confession opens a door. Walking through it costs the rest of your days. Outside, the light had sharpened. The air carried the scent of wet leaves and candle smoke that had slipped from the sanctuary into the world as if it belonged here. A breeze lifted the edge of my coat and reminded me that even a warmed body can shiver when it's telling the truth. I took 3 steps down the stone stairs and stopped. What happens tomorrow, when the hymn book is no longer in his hands, but in the hands of those who heard him? And what would I do if the first hand to reach for it was mine? The crowd thinned, then thickened again. The way people hover when the usual order has been interrupted and no one's sure what posture belongs to. Reverence. Some filed out, clutching bulletins like little shields. Others stood in small knots, whispering in the grammar of concern. A few returned to their seats and watched the pulpit as if truth might step back up and ask for an encore. He didn't hide. He stepped down from the dais and stood on the same stone aisle the rest of us walked, the hymn book in his hands, no taller than the people he had just addressed. A single shaft of late-morning light slipped through the high window and pooled at his feet, as if even the sun had decided to listen from the floor. I wasn't the first to approach him. An elderly woman with a hat like a faded rose took his hand and didn't let go. "You baptized my grandson," she said, voice warm and unafraid. "All that water wasn't counterfeit." He bowed his head, the book pressed gently to his chest. A younger man in a work shirt waited his turn and asked in a careful tone whether truth always had to hurt this much. "Only until it heals," Whitmore answered. No dramatics, no pleading. Just the clean edge of honesty, carried like a lantern. "Will you keep preaching?" someone asked from the side aisle. He looked around at the faces gathered, a constellation of souls, doubters, believers, the faithful, the tired. His thumb stroked the hymn book's worn spine. "I will keep serving," he said. "Speaking may need a season of quiet." The words fell into the sanctuary like seeds, undecided about what they would become. He motioned toward the front and invited anyone who wished to stay. "No speeches," he added softly. "Just the goodness of time." We moved as if learning a new choreography, slow, deliberate, tender. Some sat, some stood against pillars, some knelt where the stone still remembered old prayers. He placed the hymn book on the communion table, not on the pulpit. No longer a prop for authority, but a guest at the place where bread breaks. "I have something to return," he said. For a heartbeat, my stomach tightened. I thought of resignation letters and public punishments. But he reached not for a pen. He reached for the thin white stole that marked his office, and he lifted it from around his neck with both hands, the way one lifts a sleeping child. He laid it across the hymn book, not as surrender, but as an offering, the symbol of his voice resting upon the symbol of his debt. A hush moved through the room. No theatrics, no spectacle. Only cloth on leather, light on light. "I have worn this with love," he said, fingertips on the stole. "I do not know whether I'll wear it next Sunday. For now, I will wear truth." He stepped back and folded his hands, smaller than the altar, smaller than his past. It was not a fall, it was a kneeling without knees. He asked me to come forward, not with words, but with a glance that felt like a question, long rehearsed. I stood by the table, the smell of beeswax and wood polish rising like a simple prayer. He opened the hymn book to the first page and traced the inscription with the gentleness one uses to wake a child from a feverish sleep. "I will not read the letters," he said, voice steady. "They belong to mercy, not to rumor. But I will read one line from a page that guided my steps back to this room." He looked to me. I nodded. He read, "Truth is a kind of prayer. Speak it, even if your voice shakes." His voice did not shake. It trembled in the way a bell does, made for sounding, not for silence. A murmur traveled the pews, some sobbing quietly, some wiping eyes as if dust had finally lifted. A deacon cleared his throat and said, careful as a carpenter, "If a shepherd wounds himself to save a sheep, the flock must learn to walk around his injury. We'll manage." It was not absolution. It was something truer, the promise of practical love. Then there was the man I did not expect, a council member who counted coins with piety and measured words by the ounce. He stepped forward with consequences in his pocket. I could see it. But when he opened his mouth, no law came out. "I disliked you for your certainty," he admitted. "Today I find I trust you more for your doubt." Whitmore bowed his head. "Then doubt has finally done me a service." The organist, who had said nothing all morning, pressed a single chord, warm as bread. No hymn followed. Just that single note held like a hand offered across a distance. People drifted to the rail. Some placed their palms on the table, near the book, near the stole. Others kept a respectful distance, as if reverence could be measured by feet. I thought of Robert's handwriting, those letters that refused to perform. I thought of the night I let the rain do the speaking for me. I thought of the word resurrection, and how poorly we train our hearts to understand it, how we expect trumpets when often what arrives is a man setting down a strip of cloth and choosing to be small. When the room loosened again, he turned toward me, eyes bright in a face that had aged and softened in a single hour. "I want to apologize to you," he said, "not for being saved by your husband, but for hiding it while standing this close to his widow." He swallowed. "I wanted to be a good pastor more than I wanted to be an honest man. That is a confusion I will spend the rest of my days correcting." "You've begun," I said. "And you?" he asked, a hint of play caught in grief's throat. "What will you correct?" "That I mistook comfort for faith," I answered. "I've been telling myself I was strong because I survived. Strength is quieter. It tells the truth, even when no one demands it." He looked down at the book, at the stole, at the bare, clean table. "Would you—" He stopped, began again. "Would you take this home today, not as a possession, as a trust? I want to carry it again, but not until the carrying isn't a disguise." For a moment I hesitated. The sanctuary held its breath around our decision. Then I slid the stole aside like a curtain and closed the hymn book with both hands. The sound it made was soft, like a promise finishing its sentence. "I'll keep it," I said, "and I'll bring it back when it belongs here." He nodded, relief touching his features, the way morning warms the edge of a river. "Then let the space between your house and this table be my measure. When it returns, I'll know I've learned how to walk." We stood in that shared smallness until the light shifted to afternoon. People filtered out, leaving behind the scent of wool coats and tears and old wood newly honest. A child darted back in for a forgotten scarf, paused in front of us and whispered, "Was it scary?" He didn't say to whom. It didn't matter. "It was," I answered, before Whitmore could. But scary things lose their teeth when spoken. The boy nodded in the serious way children do, waved his scarf like a banner, and ran. In the narthex, a bulletin board leaned under the weight of bake sale notices and choir sign-ups and a calendar of ordinary kindness. I pinned a small blank card to it and wrote only, "Thank you for telling the truth." No name. Gratitude doesn't require authorship to be true. Outside, the day had polished itself to a clear, cool brightness. I carried the hymn book against my ribs, feeling again that familiar shape. A breeze lifted the hair at my temple. Leaves skittered along the walkway like shy confetti. The church behind me exhaled, a sound you can't hear so much as sense through the shoes you wear on holy ground. Halfway down the steps, I stopped. Habit wanted me to look back. I didn't. Not out of defiance. Out of trust. If truth had been spoken, it did not need me to supervise it. On the walk home, I passed the park where Robert once taught Emma to ride a bicycle, his hand hovering an inch from the back of the seat until she found her balance and flew. The hymn book was heavier than a bicycle seat and lighter than a life. I pressed it closer and kept moving. At my door, I waited a breath too long before turning the key, as if the inside of my house were a country requiring customs, and I had yet to declare what I was bringing in. The threshold felt like a sacrament. I crossed it. The afternoon settled into the rooms the way truth does, quietly, filling corners I hadn't noticed in months. I set the book on Robert's desk and placed the stole beside it, folded once. Sunlight crept across the wood and touched the inscription through the leather as if light could read. Only then did the question arrive, decisive as a tolling bell. Where should this belong? Not in a drawer, not in a glass case, not in my hands forever. Somewhere faithful, somewhere ordinary, somewhere that could teach me what it means to keep without hiding. I stood there unmoving, while the house waited for my answer. And then, from the street, a child laughed, bright, unafraid, like hope, discovering its echo in a place that had been quiet too long. The sound found the window, the desk, the book, my ribs. I looked at the shelf where we keep the common things: salt, matches, the family Bible with its pressed flowers and fingerprints. My fingertips brushed the space beside it. Not yet, I thought. Not yet, because when I place it there, the world I've been living in will have a new center. I left the hymn book open on the desk to breathe a little longer, and in the cooling light of the room, I felt the next small step tug at my sleeve. It wasn't grand. It never is. It was the quiet knowledge that tomorrow the same truth would have to be lived again, and again, until it stopped feeling brave and started feeling normal. The clock in the hallway released a single, agreeable chime. Even mercy keeps time. Evening came with the patience of something that knew its place. No wind, no thunder, no lingering drama, just the clean stillness of a world catching its breath after being told the truth. The house smelled faintly of rain from the open window and the lavender oil Clara always dabbed on the curtains to keep the moths away. Every small thing seemed to hum quietly, as if the walls themselves had heard the sermon and decided to start over. The hymn book rested where I had left it, on Robert's desk, the thin stole folded beside it like a loyal thought. The inscription, faintly visible through the leather, seemed to pulse with its own kind of memory. For the first time, I didn't see guilt or secrecy in those words. I saw inheritance, the kind that cannot be measured or contested. I lit the lamp, its flame steady, unbothered by the open window. Shadows lengthened across the floor like ink spilled from a calmer story. I sat down and opened the book, not to the inscription this time, but to the hymns Robert used to hum when he shaved, those half-songs that hung between key and memory. The pages felt warm from the day's sunlight. Somewhere between Blessed Assurance and Be Thou My Vision, I found a pressed violet, dry, brittle, but still unmistakably violet. I smiled. I hadn't placed it there. He must have. I held it up to the light. Its fragile shape caught the glow and turned it into something softer. That's what truth does when it's ready to be lived. It softens the air. From the street below came the sound of footsteps, laughter, the small harmonies of ordinary life resuming. Someone's radio drifted a hymn I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't in tune, but it was sincere. The church bell rang then, not the rigid call to worship, just the evening hour, a sound shaped less like command and more like memory. I realized I had been waiting for it all day without knowing why. I took the stole, folded it once more, and laid it inside the front cover of the hymn book. It looked right there, resting like a bridge between what had been hidden and what had been said. Outside, dusk was pulling its slow blue shawl over the roofs. I stood at the window and watched the last light slip behind the steeple. For a brief moment, I imagined Samuel, still standing at the altar, sleeves rolled up, putting out candles one by one. I could almost hear him breathing the air that always follows confession. Thinner, cleaner, real. He would be all right. The truth would bruise for a while, then mend. And the congregation, those dear uncertain souls, would learn to pray with their eyes open. That's all faith really asks for. I turned back to the desk. The book waited. Its leather had darkened where my hands had held it. Not a mark of possession, just proof of touch. It was time. I carried it to the shelf beside the family Bible, the one with the pressed flowers and fingerprints. The space I had left empty earlier was still there, patient. I slid the hymn book in, the stole tucked just beneath its cover. The spine aligned perfectly between psalms and letters. Somehow that felt deliberate. For a moment, I rested my hand on its top edge. "You're home now," I said quietly. The words felt final and beginning at once. I sat down by the window again, the chair creaking a friendly sound. The night had settled into that soft rhythm where everything feels possible because nothing demands it yet. I thought of Robert, of how he had carried mercy like a secret he never tried to own. I thought of Samuel, of how confession had taken the shape of grace instead of punishment. And I thought of myself, of how loss had finally turned into something gentler, an understanding that truth doesn't come to close wounds, but to keep them honest. I whispered then, half prayer, half memory. He held my hymn book as if it were his. The words were the same ones I'd spoken in the opening days of grief, but they tasted different now. No humiliation, no suspicion, only tenderness. I looked toward the shelf, and the book seemed to glow under the lamplight, not from divine light, but from the simple honesty of being where it belonged. I smiled and finished the sentence, softly, for no one but the night to hear. Now I hold it as if it were ours. The clock in the hallway marked the hour with one patient chime. The sound didn't startle me. It folded perfectly into the rhythm of breath, into the pulse of a story that had finished its first circle and begun another. Outside, a stray breeze turned a page somewhere inside the open window. I couldn't see which one, but I could hear it. A faint flutter, like an amen whispered by paper that had waited years to speak. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel watched by the past. I felt accompanied by it. The hymn book, the letters, the rain, the truth, each had done its quiet work. The rest was living,